All right, again, good morning. Welcome everybody to these training sessions, which will consist of a review of the MD targeted fiscal monitoring procedure or process. And then just housekeeping items. So we are doing this in a webinar mode. So you will not be able to speak directly if you have a question to ask, but as we go through the presentation, if you have a question and you feel like you want to speak, please put it in the chat and we can promote you as a panelist. And then as a panelist, you can unmute yourself and then ask your question, because we want to make this session interactive, because the purpose is to provide technical assistance. And if we say something that does not make sense to you, or if you say something, we say something that is not clear, please stop us, ask question, and then if needed, we can unmute you and then you will be able to ask your question. So I see something in the chat. Okay, so we are recording now. All right. If we can move to the next slide. And my name is Anthony Mukuna. I am a senior program associate for special education, school finance at Wested. I will be presenting today with Mari, and I will let her introduce herself and say hello.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Mari Shikazawa. I'm a program associate with Wested, and we are just so excited to be with you all today.
All right. Thank you so much, Mari. So as I said, Mari will be covering some of the slides throughout this presentation. So this presentation will be done in 2 days. You received an invitation for today and tomorrow. So we're doing 2 separate sessions, 1 hour each. We did not want to have you spend 2 hours listening to us, because you could easily fall asleep, especially when it comes to fiscal matters. So that's why we will break this down into 2 sessions, and then hopefully you will come back tomorrow with more motivation. And what do we have in the agenda today and tomorrow? The purpose of this training is to provide technical assistance. The Mississippi Department of Education has contracted with Wested to provide technical assistance to all the LEAs that have been selected for the targeted fiscal monitoring activities of the fall of 2022, next year. And Mississippi MDE wanted to take an approach that will help LEA succeed. How do you do that? Before you get through the monitoring review, they want to give you tools. They want to build your capacity so that you will be prepared when time comes for the review. And that's the purpose of the training, is to provide technical assistance that will help you develop ability to do a self-assessment of your fiscal procedures so that you know where you stand. If you have area that you need to improve, you can take some proactive approach before the MD shows up and then review your documents, instead of taking a reactive approach. When they tell you you're doing something wrong, now you're trying to fix it, it's pretty much too late in the game. Here, we will take a different approach, help you get ready so that when time comes, you will be able to demonstrate to MDE reviewers that you've been doing your work in accordance to all the federal rules and state regulation. All right, and what do we have in the agenda? First of all, we'll go over the purpose of the training, and then Mari will give us a quick review of the federal regulation that directly impacts fiscal monitoring. Because some of you might wonder, who gives the MD the authority to do all these IDEA, special education fiscal monitoring review? Then Mari will walk you through all the regulation language. And then she'll also give us a quick introduction of the Mississippi Department of Education fiscal monitoring system that was implemented last year, or earlier this year, sorry. And then we'll go over the targeted fiscal monitoring protocol. The targeted fiscal monitoring protocol is the tool that the MDE uses when they conduct review of LEAs. Then it includes a set of questions, checklists, and then we will help you understand what the reviewer at the MDE look at when they review your file. That will help you, kind of expect what is to come when you are selected for a review. With that being said, let's get started. If you can go to the next slide. Purpose. So like I said, this is technical assistance for LEAs to help you build your capacity to do a self-assessment of your fiscal procedures and practices. And if we go to the next slide, why does it matter? Why is it important at this point? The first reason is because, as I said earlier, if you have been invited to this training, that means you are the lucky one. MD, Bobby, the team selected you because they like you so much. Next year, you will be participating in the targeted fiscal monitoring activity. So, with that being said, they want you to get ready. When the time of the review comes, you will be more prepared. And now, with this training, LEA will be able to better anticipate what to expect during the monitoring process and then more meaningfully participate in the process. So you will be able to have maybe more informed conversation with the MDE reviewer when you go through fiscal monitoring. And Wested will also be there to coach you, provide technical assistance, and then help you develop your capacity to do a self-assessment, an assessment of your own practices, and identify the different area of potential non-compliance, which could become a finding next year when you go through the entire review process. And if you go to the next slide, then what is the process we'll use to help us get there? So Wested will support LEA, help you get ready for the technical assistance, like I said, and provide coaching. And throughout this process, the first thing is to help you understand MD fiscal monitoring protocol, what it is, what it means. We'll also help you better understand MD expectations, especially when they want you to submit some type of documentation or some type of report. We've noticed that sometimes this could create a confusion. A finding could just be the result of the LEA not understanding what they were supposed to submit to the reviewer. And then when a reviewer does not receive what he wants, then it's easier to just say you're not compliant. So important to understand what is expected, what documents, what reports they hope and want you to submit. Wested will also assist LEA do a review of their own fiscal policies and procedures to try to determine if your fiscal policies and procedures are aligned with federal, states, law and regulations and policies. If you could identify any area of improvement to make sure that all your written policies are and procedures are in writing and compliant. And then Wested will assist LEA conduct a mock review of sample evidence that they will submit. So together we will work and then help you develop that ability to do a review of your own documents. If you submit a copy of invoice, documentation, time and effort document, you look at it, are you going to be able to say this is what I'm doing wrong, or this is where I can make some changes? So Wested will, throughout this coaching session, help you develop that capacity to understand where you need to adjust, where you need to change before the fall of 2022. Next slide. If we go to the next slide. So WestEd approach is to, go back to the next slide. So WestEd approach is to focus on continuous improvement and progress toward compliance. We're not here to try to issue findings to tell you that you're doing something wrong, but we're trying to move you from point A to point B. If before this coaching and training session, you were maybe, out of potential compliance with 20 items, if we can get you from 20 to like 5 items, that will be better. That will be a great achievement. But we also want you to develop that ability to take actions when you see that there is a potential of non-compliance with federal regulation. Take a proactive approach, like I said earlier, not a reactive approach. Do it before it's too late, when you see it. And then this will be done through coaching and technical assistance. So this is an overview of our activity. And then I want to go over the timelines. If you go to the next slide.
And Anthony, can I just interject for 2 minutes? I just want to provide 2 points of clarification as well. Is while LEAs are required to participate in at least one coaching technical assistance call with WestEd, please note that the activities that Anthony just went over, those are all voluntary. So we're not going to be forcing you to engage in any of those specific tracks. It's going to be up to your LEA to determine which services and supports would best meet their needs. And then the other piece that Anthony touched on is that these technical assistance calls will be confidential. So we will not be relaying any of this information to MDE directly around potential areas of non-compliance. So again, that will stay within our teams. And so when we're looking at this, just know that our goal is really to help support you. And it's not going to result in Mississippi coming in and saying, this is a red flag, this is a finding before any monitoring activities happen.
Yeah, really good point, Mari. So when we will have those initial, like we have one initial required initial meetings, and then after that, we can have more coaching sessions. MD staff will not be invited. So I'm sorry, Bobby, Alicia, or whoever, you will not be joining the party. And then the conversation we'll have with LEAs, we'll have conversation in Vegas. So what happens there stays there. So you should feel confident that comfortable sharing with us your documents, because we're there to try to help you. Okay, and then the timeline. Today is the fiscal monitoring training. We're doing first fiscal monitoring training number 1 today, and we'll do the second one tomorrow. And from November 22nd to March 31st, we will have coaching and technical assistance activities. The first meeting will be a mandatory meeting. And then during this meeting, we'll give you just an overview of what the activity will look like. If you decide that you want to pursue the technical assistance, then we'll have additional meeting to help you develop and build capacity to be ready when time comes next year. So this was a quick introduction and overview of what we will be doing. So if you go to the next slide, I think, Mari, you will take it over from here, right? And go over the uniform grant guidance.
Yes, thank you so much, Anthony. So before we go into the uniform grant guidance more in depth, we have a quick poll for you. So Ishwa, if you want to move to the next slide. So we would love to know, how would you rate your knowledge of federal grants fiscal monitoring requirements? So if you could just take a few minutes to respond to the question in the poll in front of you. If you're having issues seeing the poll or otherwise, feel free to include your answer in the chat if you want to, or just rate it for yourself independently. There is no wrong or right answer, and we can't see who's responding what. So feel free to answer honestly. We'll give it just another minute or so. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. So get in any final answers and let's share the results. Thank you. So we see a few people coming in at weak, the majority coming in at fair, and the upper quartile coming in at strong. So that's great. That gives us a really good idea of where everybody is coming from. And we're hoping that we can help bump those scores up at least one level throughout the duration of this training. Thank you. Ishwa, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you so much. So now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how the Uniform Grant Guidance helps to define how monitoring looks like within MDE. So first, subrecipient monitoring. So under 2 CFR 200-332, MDE must evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance with federal statutes, regulations, and subaward terms and conditions, may conduct risk assessments before or after subawards are made, and must use a risk assessment results to determine appropriate subrecipient monitoring activities. So what does this look like in practice? Annually, MDE actually conducts a risk assessment for all LEAs that helps to determine which LEAs will be monitoring using intensive monitoring protocols. So this is separate from the targeted cyclical monitoring. But for those LEAs that are selected to participate in intensive monitoring and are also as part of a cohort for that cyclical targeted monitoring, those activities will be combined. So you don't have to worry about any duplication of work or effort on your side. Ishwa, do we want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So this next we have our fiscal monitoring tools. So providing training and technical assistance on program related matters, that the MDE is obviously always available to support you and provide TA, both when you're going through part of the monitoring cycle, as well as preemptive support or subsequent support to help close out findings. And again, like Anthony said, the MDE is investing resources by contracting with WestEd so that we're able to provide you that technical assistance prior to actually going through the monitoring cycle to again, help prepare you and to give you time to fix those potential areas of noncompliance before they become formal findings. And really this is meant to help save some time, right? Because you're able to fix these areas on the front end before going through the formal correction process. Next, conducting on-site reviews of the subrecipients program operations. So again, this is done through that intensive monitoring. And sorry, Ishwa, if you could go back to the slide before, where we have one more bullet there. And then lastly, arranging for agreed upon procedures, engagements. So those would include those audit services. Okay, next, sorry. And lastly, under the Uniform Grant Guidance, we have our favorite or least favorite topic, the enforcement mechanism. So in specific instances, it may be that MDA has to use enforcement mechanisms to ensure the proper stewardship of these funds. And in these instances, MDE can impose special conditions. So this could include directing the use of funds or increasing reporting and oversight to MDE, temporary withholding cash payments pending correction of the deficiency, or more severe enforcement action. So this is why it's really important to have a solid communication with the MDE in the event, for example, that you're not going to meet agreed upon timelines as part of a corrective action plan, or have actual questions about what the correction must look like in practice in order to close out a finding. The next is disallowing all or part of the costs of the activity or action not in compliance. So related to fiscal monitoring, this could include payback for disallowed funds, which nobody wants. Then we have suspending or terminating the federal award. And lastly, withholding further federal awards for the program or project.
And then if I can add something, Mari, this is a good list of, the tools that the federal regulation is giving the MDE as a pass-through entity to use against you. But our goal, ideally, will be to put yourself in the position where the MDE will never want or need to use any of this. That's our goal. I just wanted to reinforce that.
No, yes, that's a really good point. And just so you know, I know, like personally with our relationship with MDE, we know that they never want to use these. So let us help you to make sure that no one gets put in that pickle of a situation. So Ashwa, if we can go to the next slide. you. So now let's dive into a high-level overview of the actual monitoring process. Thank you. So the purpose of monitoring is to monitor the programmatic and financial activities of Mississippi LEAs as required under the Uniform Grant Guidance that we just saw, implement a cyclical and risk-based monitoring system, and to improve compliance, accountability, and technical assistance. So additionally, it's really important to note that these monitoring procedures and protocols that we'll be going over today, those are what set the standards for this fiscal monitoring and oversight based on those federal requirements that we were looking at through the Uniform Grant Guidance. They're meant to standardize evaluation and monitoring guidelines to ensure really that these monitoring activities are carried out consistently across LEAs. So we're not looking at who's our favorite LEA and then changing that monitoring protocol to make sure that they have less findings of non-compliance. And then lastly, to identify each component of the subrecipient fiscal monitoring for you guys to have a general understanding of what the scope of this is going to be. So the protocol is what is used to both define the scope as well as what the actual implementation procedures of those are, and that we'll get into later in this session. We could go to the next slide. Thank you. So for procedures and methodology, the MDE monitoring process includes 3 differentiated levels of subrecipient monitoring. So the first is that universal monitoring, and this includes all LEAs every year. So those activities are the LEA application for funds review, audit report reviews, ongoing monitoring of allowable uses of funds through that funding application, monitoring the timely expenditure of funds, implementation of the risk rubric, and a whole slew of other items that you might not even realize are incorporated as part of this universal monitoring. And then there is the targeted cyclical monitoring, which we will be discussing at great length over the next 2 days. And that includes the virtual desk audit of accounting and fiscal records. And again, we'll be looking at the scope of those protocols shortly. And then we have our intensive risk-based monitoring, which includes both the virtual desk audit, so as part of the targeted cyclical monitoring protocol, as well as an on-site review of fiscal and accounting records. And this builds upon the protocol that is developed for the cyclical monitoring. And again, LEAs are selected for intensive monitoring using the risk rubric results. And lastly, ongoing technical assistance, which can include technical assistance and coaching from WestEd. So now let's talk a little bit about the monitoring techniques and cycles, excuse me. So targeted fiscal monitoring uses that sequential sampling monitoring, as we were kind of discussing. So this is done by dividing LEAs into cohorts for review. So currently MDE has a 5-year cyclical cohort schedule. So we're making sure that every LEA is monitored at least once every 5 years. And then that intensive fiscal monitoring, which again includes those LEAs selected based on the results of the risk rubric to monitor those LEAs that are identified as high risk. And then we have reporting, which we'll get into a little bit more in the next few slides. Next is the corrective action plan, which may be required by the MDE based on the findings, and that would also include a timeline for correction. And then lastly, those enforcement mechanisms.
Mari, one clarification.
Mm-hmm.
I just also wanted to remind that, even though your LE is included in the targeted cyclical monitoring system, cohort, sorry, but in a given year, the MDE has the discretion to decide that, you're in a cohort, we want to move your review from targeted to intensive. MDE still has that discretion. So don't be surprised if, for example, as it gets close to fall, they say like, maybe we need to go intensive with you instead of targeted. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So now let's talk a little bit more in depth about that targeted physical monitoring. So again, it's based on sequential sampling. And then the monitoring cycle is the same 5-year cycle as the MDE's programmatic monitoring. So that's to help ensure alignment and coordination of monitoring activities, making sure that we're not going in one year and then going in the next year, really just trying to streamline those activities. Also, each LEA will be required to participate in a desk audit and interviews. So MDE can provide a list of items, or they will provide a list of items required to complete for the desk audit, which again is an area that we can help you to prepare for. So if there's any questions about what this report actually needs to include, what these look like, how do you prioritize and select what documentation to improve? There are some, there are some strategies that would be helpful likely when selecting the documentation to submit. And then technical assistance. So each LEA will receive that technical assistance based on findings of non-compliance or suggestions to improve internal controls. There might be areas where it's not necessarily a finding of non-compliance, but definitely that is an area that's been flagged that could be improved upon in order to ensure proper stewardship. So again, WestEd is also available to provide that technical assistance to help reduce that number of findings of non-compliance and to strengthen that system so we can kind of play for both pieces. And then lastly, the benefits include that each LEA is monitored at least every 5 years. So increasing that oversight and ensuring that LEAs are receiving the assistance that they need, developing more sustaining relationship with LEAs. So again, this is really a way for MDE to communicate and top down and bottom up with their LEAs around what those needs are, and accountability to inform that technical assistance being offered either by MDE or by WestEd. And again, just another flag. So we're not going to be including a list of areas that WestEd has supported LEAs with, and anything will remain confidential, but we do hope to compile a list of broad patterns that we're seeing to help better focus and streamline MDE TA and support for LEAs as well in the future. Next slide. So now we'll talk a little about the post-monitoring activities. And one item that is not included, I just realized we did have an additional item added to this deck, but is a preliminary review. So every time that you participate in any monitoring activity, whether it's cyclical or intensive, you will receive a preliminary review notes document within 30 days of when MDE receives all of the LEA materials. And then you'll have 30 days to respond to the preliminary review notes and submit additional documentation. And really, the purpose for this is that given how many documents and reports are required to be submitted, we completely understand, and MDE completely understands that sometimes items may have accidentally been omitted. So we wanted to build in that time to ensure that LEAs can submit that documentation. And again, this is just an area that MDE would like to use to help build these relationships. Like Anthony said, it's way easier just to issue a finding. It's a lot more difficult and time consuming to dive deeper with LEAs to make sure that they are in compliance, and we're not going to issue a finding of non-compliance that isn't real. So then once the LEA sends their response and MD has a chance to review any additional or subsequent documentation or reports submitted, then MDE will review and issue a final monitoring report, which is prepared within 30 days of receipt of that final documentation. And that final monitoring report includes a schedule of fiscal monitoring findings, which includes the findings, associated regulations, and corrective actions that the LEA may take. So these are not comprehensive. These are just the recommended corrective action, but the LEA may know of other ways that better meets their needs to correct those findings. And the monitoring report also, again, includes those suggestions on how to improve internal controls. So not just the findings, but other suggestions as well. And then MDE is available to meet with LEAs to review those findings. And this might not always be necessary because sometimes the findings are very straightforward. But if the LEA does want to meet, there's always that availability and flexibility to discuss any items that are not clear. And then the LEA must respond to the finding within 30 days. So within 30 days, the LEA must submit a written response within 30 days that outlines how corrective action will be taken and when it will take place. So that's part of that corrective action plan. And then lastly, findings are not addressed will prompt the use of those enforcement mechanisms by MDE. So this can include technical assistance, additional restrictions of IDA funds, directing the use of funds, et cetera. And I think Ishwa, can you go to the next slide? Perfect. Any questions? We just kind of wanted to give you a high level overview of what this process was going to be looking like, working with WestEd and going over the monitoring protocol. So we'll give you guys just a few minutes. Please free to include anything in the chat or raise your hand and we can bring you to the stage. Perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it to Anthony to do a deep dive of the actual targeted fiscal monitoring protocol.
Okay, thank you so much, Maury. A really great review of the regulation and then a good summary of the MD fiscal monitoring process. So like we said, if you have questions, always feel free to stop us because these things make sense to us, but we really want to make sure that they make sense to you too. It's easier to feel like, you understand it, but, if you don't, it's time for you to ask for clarification. Don't be intimidated by anybody here. Okay. So now let's talk about the targeted fiscal monitoring, planning, and expectation. If we go to the next slide. So like I said earlier, if you receive this invitation, that means you are the lucky one. You have been chosen by the MD to go through fiscal monitoring activities next year. You're part of this cohort. So now that you're the lucky one and you're here, what do you need to prepare for your review next year? Now we will get into the meat of the training at this point. If we go to the next slide. Before we go over what you need to prepare, how about we pause for a little bit and then give you a good summary of the structure of the targeted fiscal monitoring protocol. The targeted fiscal monitoring protocol is a tool that MD reviewers will use when making assessments of your fiscal procedures and practices to determine whether or not you are in compliance with the federal regulation, state regulation, and then policies. And that targeted fiscal monitoring protocol has 5 big components or sections. The first one is called cost principle. The second one is called time and effort. The third one is called IDA specific requirements. The fourth is called financial management system. And the last one is written fiscal policies and procedures. So when you are subject to targeted fiscal monitoring, then these are the areas that will be reviewed. And then I wanted to share with you, if you allow me to share my screen for a minute, Ishwa, I wanted to share with the participants just how the form looks like. And this was made available to you when the MD implemented the new fiscal monitoring procedure. The targeted monitoring protocol just looks like this document you have in the screen. Are you able to see my screen? Yeah, okay. So the first page is just information regarding the LEA, the reviewer that are interviewing or conducting the review. A quick statement about the purpose of the form, and then we get to the section, like I shared with you in the previous slide. Section 1 is called cost principle and expenditure. That's where you have the LEA, the MD will do an assessment of your compliance, your level of compliance with cost principle and expenditure requirements. In summary, that's pretty much testing if the cost that you incurred under IDA were allowable. Allowable under IDA, Uniform Grant Guidance, EDGAR, and all the state's policies and procedures. And then the process that an MD reviewer is using to try to determine whether or not you are in compliance is by going through a series of questions, or can call it checklist, to see if, like, for this question, are you in compliance, yes or no? If it's a no, that's pretty much the first indication that they'll need to do some follow-up, gather evidence, and if no evidence is presented, you know what happens. Maybe you'll be subject to finding. So do we have a question?
We do. Kimberly asked, will we get this form or were we supposed to have it already? And that's a great question, Kimberly. I think what we'll do is we'll send this out after today's training so that you're able to follow along with the document tomorrow as well. That's a great point.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, the form was, I think, included in the fiscal monitoring manual, but yeah, if it was not shared with you guys, you definitely will need to share it. So like I said, these questions will help the MD reviewer assess your level of compliance with allowability of cost. And then this is a series of questions. So when we do self-assessments, it's pretty much you will be taking the role of an MD reviewer. An MD reviewer does a state level assessment of the LEA and then punishes you when you're not in compliance. How about you put yourself in the shoes of an MDE reviewer and you do that assessment yourself? That's why we call it an LEA self-assessment. And then based on this question, if you're able to say yes, no, then it will give you an indication on where you are. Do you have something else in the chat?
No, we're good to go.
Okay. So we have section 1 is cost principle. Section 2 is time and efforts, with some questions here. Question 3 is IDA fiscal requirements. Question 4 is financial management review. And then something that I also wanted to mention with you, if you see this form, you will see that for section 4, we have items with a strike through. And this was left there on purpose. We did not want to delete it, but I think the MD will be doing this review in the future. It's part of the requirements, but based on the fact that maybe like additional guidance might need to be provided. So that's the reason why next year when they do the review, some of these questions will not be tested, but you just need to keep in mind that, in the future, you will be subject to some type of testing for these questions because they cover all the different federal requirements when it comes to financial management. So just something to keep in mind. And then we have a review of written fiscal policies and procedures. So quick overview of the form. Now, Ishwa, if we can go back to the slide. I'll probably have to take the screen back again, but yeah. So this is a summary, and I just wanted to show you what the form, the protocol looks like in more details. And then let's start with section 1 of the form. If you can go to the next slide. Like I said, section 1 of the targeted fiscal monitoring review is called cost principle. And what is the purpose of the cost principle or expenditure section? The purpose of a reviewer going through this is to test allowability of costs charged to the IDA. They want to determine whether or not a cost was allowable. Then I'll go through like the uniform grant guidance requirement. Was this reasonable, necessary? Can this be allocated to a special education program? Was this consistent with the LEA practices? All these different things under the federal regulation. Was this an expenditure for special education or related services? So they go through all these different questions to make a determination that yes, the costs that were charged to the grant were allowable. And in addition to that, they will also be testing your internal control procedure and practices for expenditure approval to make sure that you have good process in place to ensure that funds are being spent following the internal control requirements under the Uniform Grant Guidance. So, in order to achieve that goal, an MDE reviewer will need some document from you because they could never come to a conclusion that a cost was allowable if they don't have access to your report. That's the reason why the document request is the first step where you need or you get to play a role in this review process. They will send you a list of documents that must be submitted to the MDE for a reviewer to do the review. And the documents usually include, but are not limited to these three. They would want to see a detailed revenue and expenditure report. When I say detailed, it means an itemized type of report, not an aggregated type of report, because you will not know if a cost is allowable unless you have an opportunity to see the individual costs. Let's say you were paying for supplies. An LEA could have expenditure for supplies during the entire fiscal year. And you have some report that you could run that would give you a total amount of all your supply purchases. Let's say supply expenditures were $20,000 for the entire year. But if you only have that type of report, you cannot tell which supplies was purchased. What is the vendor from where the supply was purchased? What was the individual cost of the specific supply? Because these are the level of information that a reviewer will need to do a test on a single cost. That is the reason why the detailed expenditure report is really important. Everything starts there. Expenditures that are grouped together does not give you that level of clarity. And then the next item is they would want you to submit some type of supporting documentation for this specific or individual purchase. If you're paying for a supply or for a service, submit an invoice, a purchase order. And if you were buying some type of equipment, like, what do you have any packing slip documenting that whatever was purchased was actually received? Because you could buy something, you could pay for something, but if that item never got to the school, if that item was never received, how can you ensure that, yes, the item was purchased for and used for the intended purpose? So that's the reason why documentation plays an important role in determining whether or not a cost is allowable. And they also want you to submit, it could be up to maybe more, 10 supporting documentation of your reimbursement request. And I think we should have corrected this because the reimbursement is submitted through MCAPS, not Magic. Just, and then Bobby or Alicia, correct me if I'm wrong. The reimbursement requests from LEAs are submitted through MCAPS.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so now our bad will get that corrected. So up to 10 supporting documentation of your MCAPS reimbursement request, because they want to see if you were getting reimbursed for those expenditures that were charged to the grants and that were allowable. Also to determine whether the reimbursement was applied to expenditures incurred during the period of availability of a grant. So these testing all have a purpose because IDA funds to be allowable a cost must be reasonable, necessary, and also must have been incurred during the period of availability of the grant. If your grant was not available before July 1st, and then you request a reimbursement in June, then you may be requesting reimbursement for expenditure that you did not incur yet. So this step will help them determine whether or not you're getting reimbursed for obligated expenditures. Any question about it? I think this could be a lot of information. Easily, I could put you to bed. So feel free to go get some coffee or tea if you're falling asleep, and then ask questions if you need more clarification. Okay, if we don't, then let's move to the next slide. Just remember that we have some questions. We have some poll to see if you guys were paying attention to what we just shared. So this is just an example of what a revenue report would look like. Depending on the type of financial management system that you use, running revenue reports could be called in different ways. Sometimes that could be the biggest challenge LEA have when they're being asked to submit specific reports. We might be saying something, but your financial management system uses a different language. Whether you're using Marathon or you're using any other school level financial management system, the language will be different. But it's important to pay attention to not the name, but the content of the reports you're submitting. Because my report includes the specific information that is expected from the MDE. For a revenue report, for example, that type of, the report must include like information related to your funds. You know, where you're getting reimbursed for your school age or the 619 funds. Like it could be like fund 2610 or fund 2620. Also the date. What was the date of your reimbursements? Any type of documents number, a description, and the amounts. And amounts that could easily be reconciled to the specific request that you submitted through MCAPS. So if you had a reimbursement request of 20,000, then the reviewer must be able to trace that 20,000 into your revenue report. So that's the level of information you need to incorporate in that type of reporting. And like I said, it could have different name, but the content is more important than the naming. If you go to the next slide. This is an example of a detailed expenditure report. A reviewer to be able to do a test which will determine whether or not a cost is allowable under the federal rules and regulation, they need to get access to your detailed expenditure reports. And you also need to keep in mind that the detailed expenditure report total, when you get the total of all the line items, that total should be an amount that could be reconciled to your total IDE expenditures. Because this will give an indication that the detailed expenditure report is capturing everything, is capturing all your information, all your expenditures. Because if you leave some expenditures out, then the reviewer could do an assessment of your compliance using partial expenditures. And then some reports could include critical details that might be missed. So that's the reason why submitting an expenditure report with the total that could be reconciled to your total expenditure number for the specific grants period is important. And also, what are the critical information that must be included in the report? And this language will probably make more sense to business managers, CFOs, as opposed to if you're like a special education director. But it's good information to have because you guys are all involved in the process. First of all, you need to make sure that your report includes funds, the funds number. Is it the 2610 or 2620? Your objects function codes, because we have specific function codes under the special education program that you use. So we have a question? Finally.
Yes. Paula asked, how many years back will the financial portion of the audit cover?
Okay, that is a good question. And then I don't want to speak for the MDE, but I'll just give a, an in general response, but MDE stuff, feel free to weigh in. So the review normally is focused in one specific fiscal year, right? But this fiscal monitoring is not like your typical annual LEA audit. The fiscal monitoring focused on a specific fiscal year, but the reviewer has the authority and the power to go all the way up to the record retention requirements. And then under the Uniform Grant Guidance, it's approximately 6 years. If, let's say, they're reviewing document for fiscal year 2021, your LEA could go all the way back, the reviewer could go all the way back to 2016 if they want to review something, even if the review is not focused on just one specific fiscal year. So I don't know if that answers your question, and Bobby and Alicia, feel free to weigh in.
This is Bobby, and Alicia, you can weigh in as well, but that is correct, Anthony. It's just that the previous fiscal year that we look at monitoring, and then if we see things and we have the authority to ask all the way back, yes.
Yeah. So then you just must be prepared to provide information for the last 6 fiscal year. But yeah, in general, the documents will start with a request specific to one fiscal year, and usually the most recent fiscal year that ended. And if this is done in the fall of 2022, I'm assuming the fiscal year will be like fiscal year 21-22. Focus. So yeah, Maurice added a good point. If you're able to share with us the vendor for your financial management system that you use, that must be helpful, because like I said, these reports could be called different names depending on what type of financial management you use. But just pay attention to the content. Make sure your report includes invoice number, invoice date, expenditures date, the amount of that specific purchase payments, the vendor, and the purpose of our description. These are the key elements that the reviewer would expect to see to allow them to do a more comprehensive testing on allowability of cost. And if we go to the next slide, I mentioned invoice. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have seen an invoice before, but in case you've never seen it, this is what an invoice looks like. Even when you're not a business manager, I mean, you're special education director, I mean, you approve invoice, sometimes you have to sign off on everything. And then I see Alicia say that OMG will provide the various names of report and the ones that will need to be arrested. Okay, Alicia, thank you so much. That's helpful, because the naming of reports is a big issue. And then if the Office of Grant Management could help with that, that would make the coaching and technical assistance process easier for us. All right, and then if we can go to the next slide, and we'll do the poll, and this will mark the end of the session for today. We will continue tomorrow. So if you're paying attention to what Azure shared, Ishwa, could you launch a poll? What is the purpose of section 1, cost principle of the targeted fiscal monitoring protocol? A, is this to test allowability of cost? Is it to test internal control procedure for expenditure approval? Is it A and B, or is it none of the above? This is a typical Anthony question, tricky question. I like tricking people when I ask questions. So this also will be a way to assess how well I did in sharing the information.
And Anthony, we have a question in the chat. Will the MCAP's expenditure detail and request for funds suffice for the invoice?
Oh, okay. Great question.
And
No.
Alicia, thank you, Alicia.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Alicia was like,
No.
Okay. Thank you, Alicia.
And the reason why is because we'll be comparing the invoices that you submit to the actual detailed expenditure report. So it's almost like we're double checking different items.
Yep. Good points. Are we ready to close the poll
Yes.
and share the results? All right. 14% said yes for testing allowability of costs. 6% to test internal control procedure for expenditure approval. 81% A and B, and that was the trick. A, B, you are right, but there was a better answer, C, which includes A and B. So that was the trick right there, but 81% is a B, so B is a good note for everybody. So I think this will mark the end of the first part of our training today. Thank you so much for your participation, and then feel free to follow up with any questions that you have for us. But we do expect to see you back here tomorrow to continue diving into the fiscal monitoring protocol and documentation expected from you by the MDE. Mari, anything?
And one final note, just so you guys are aware, you received a reminder for this session, and it included a link to sign up for your first technical assistance calls. And so you'll be able to schedule those directly. We'll resend that out as well. Again, that first meeting is required for all LEAs to participate in. It's just a 30-minute consultation meeting. And then we can discuss the different tracks and direction that best meet your LEA's needs. But if you haven't signed up yet, please do take the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bobby, Alicia, anything else to add? Or are we good to adjourn today?
Good, thank you.
All right, yeah, so we'll stop here. So we figured that an hour of us was going to be enough. So you're off the hook, and see you back tomorrow here. Same time.